Welcome to Global View. Join us on this multi-visual journey around the world.
And now we're friends with China. In fact, maybe we've never had a better relationship, and we're working with them very closely on the coronavirus. We're working with them very, very closely. We only have 5 people. Hopefully everything's going to be great. They have somewhat of a problem, but hopefully it's all going to be great. But we're working with China, just so you know, and other countries very, very closely, so it doesn't get out of hand. But it's, you know, it's something that we have to be very, very careful with, right?
Back during the H1N1 swine flu a few years ago, we had, I think, 35 million vaccines that were supposed to be shipped from Australia to the U.S., and they didn't send them. We had trouble with Canada and Great Britain getting stuff. The point, I think, which is the interesting one, is that it's going to be really important for us to onshore our pharmaceutical manufacturing as well as our medical supplies.
Yeah.
The N95 mask, that's a respirator mask. That's the one that our healthcare professionals are going to need to fight things like seasonal flu and this coronavirus.
Yeah.
China has eliminated all exports. And it's effectively nationalized foreign companies like 3M, taking them over. And I think that just underscores the need for us to focus on onshoring at least some of our capacity.
Right, and that's what the president has been trying to do with the USMCA and with the China deal, trying to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. and all of these things that we need. Look, I got to get to 2 more things because I want to get your take on Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's speech at the governor's, but I also want to get your take on what you've been doing in terms of counterfeiting. But before that, I've got to ask you about the trust issue with China. They knew that coronavirus had happened back in December. They sent a delegation to the White House to shake everybody's hand. They knew that they had this virus that had started for the phase 1. Then they sent the largest delegation ever to Davos. And now the ambassador to China was on one of the Sunday shows this weekend, and he did not deny that coronavirus could have started in a weapons lab. I mean, this is huge stuff. I mean, he really needed a follow-up on this, but he didn't deny it. Senator Tom Cotton has been tweeting about this. Do we know if this started in a research lab, and how come they won't allow the CDC in there to better understand how this started? Because if they started this in a weapons lab, that's evidence that they are developing or trying to develop weapons of mass destruction, biological weapons.
So let's try to unpack a lot of things that's going on there. I think that the question of how this started ultimately has to be answered. I don't think now is necessarily the time to do that, because what we have to do is fight the crisis first. But China will have to be held accountable for how that started. 14 years ago, in a book called The Coming China Wars that I wrote, I actually predicted a pandemic from virus from China precisely because of the way they run their country in terms of their animal husbandry practices. So whether it was bats or other things, I'm not really sure at this point, but I was very surprised that the Chinese ambassador did not answer that question.
Well, Mike Pompeo was at the Governors Association talking about the way that China tries to dominate. Are they tracking Americans regularly? I mean, I know they're tracking the Chinese citizens, but are they also tracking us here?
We're all targets politically, and it goes down, as Secretary Pompeo noted in his speech, to the state and local levels. It's trying to deal with China. They're an authoritarian country. They don't allow us to go over there and try to influence their political system, and we have no intention of doing that.
Yeah.
But they do come here and certainly do that. That speech, I urge everybody to watch it on YouTube and read it, because it identified things like the 1,000 Talents program as well as pressure that China puts.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the thing that's most concerning people about China right now, which is coronavirus emanating from Wuhan. Clearly, the Chinese government didn't handle this well to begin with. Crackdown on information.
You're being much too charitable.
Well, I mean,
they knew about this in December. Okay, and they knew about this through the we now know the
there were
cab
8
drivers,
doctors on the
8
ground.
doctors who were arrested,
they refused
essentially, right?
To allow them to.
And also the cab drivers and WhatsApp, WeChat.
What's the correct American response to a potential pandemic, an outbreak right now, more serious than SARS was? Given the level of interlinkage that our countries, our people, our economies have? What should Trump be doing?
Number one, offer the CDC and other great organizations throughout the world to go and assist the Chinese Communist Party, to go assist. What we should do now, I think, is try to make sure we limit it to China as much as possible. Number two, remember the victims here are the Chinese people, right? Whether we need to do fundraisers here or relief funds, et cetera, is to think about how you get, because now you see the breakdown of their logistics system.
Because Trump's first orientation usually is not towards how do we raise humanitarian aid for people that aren't in the United States. I mean, even Puerto Rico, which is a part of the United States, he was criticized for.
But look, I disagree. Look what he did. Look what he did for the first 2 weeks of this with Xi. He was saying he had Xi's back. Xi's telling me he has this under control. We'll work with the Chinese. Remember, these tweets are out there saying, "Hey, Xi tells me it's under control. We will support it." You know, people shouldn't raise their level of concern. But when it became evident that Xi doesn't have control of this, that's when I think the president stepped forward with very, very measured response. Remember, right now, what you're hearing coming out of Wuhan is literally a breakdown of the public health infrastructure.
As a new coronavirus spreads rapidly from central China, investors are starting to get an idea of its global impact. First up, economic growth. The virus spread just ahead of the Chinese New Year holiday. That's when hundreds of millions of Chinese normally hit the shops and travel to visit family. Supply chains have also been disrupted, with many businesses closing operations in China. It could cause growth in China to slow to around 4%, from 6% in the last quarter, according to Nomura estimates. That's actually worse than the 2003 SARS episode. Second, the Chinese currency, which has weakened amidst concerns about economic growth in China. The yuan briefly broke 7 to the dollar in offshore trading on Thursday before recovering slightly. The currency's slide reduces some of the gains chalked up after the initial US-China trade deal and Washington's decision to take China out of a list of trading partners that it considers to be currency manipulators. Third up, travel and luxury stocks. Travel has been curtailed and some airlines have stopped routes at a time when demand for flights was already dampened. High-end brands that rely on Chinese consumers have been affected too. Global travel and leisure stocks have dropped around 5% in the past 2 weeks as the virus has spread.
The cover of The Economist was rather clever. It was a globe with a surgical mask in the form of the Chinese flag on it. Where are we right now in this? What are the economic effects likely to be?
Well, we don't really know, but my suspicion is that they are going to be quite a lot bigger even than those numbers that you cited. And let me tell you why, and I'm very struck how little reaction there has been in markets.
Markets just keep going up and up. They took a hit for a couple of days, but they're back up now again. Are the markets getting it wrong? And are economists getting it wrong? Are economists underestimating the possible effects?
Well, I think what economists have done in the market is focus on the near-term GDP effects that you mentioned, and I have no reason to quarrel with those numbers. But I agree with Zanny. First of all, China's starting off in a much weaker economy going into this than was true during SARS. It's, as Zanny pointed out, 4 times the share of world output that it once was, and the global connections are important. I also think another casualty here is fueling China skepticism around the world, particularly in our own country, that may weaken global supply chains. So I think the market's maybe shrugging a bit too much here.
All of the Western companies are taking all of their non-essential personnel out of China now. People are moving out. If this goes on for months rather than weeks, I think you have a really profound impact. People will say, can we rely on a Chinese supply chain?
What does it do to the U.S. economy?
Well, I think for the U.S. economy, it will be very modest in terms of a GDP effect in the near term. But again, if global supply chains fracture, that is a big change for business. And don't forget the Chinese economy itself. Internal problem in the Chinese economy or perceived lack of legitimacy of the regime has big global implications.
In fact, we have these viruses come up more and more often, I guess particularly in part because the human occupation infringes on nature. I mean, you know, and for example, in China, people are saying they're living closer to bats now as a practical matter, and so they come into contact with one another. So we're going to have it more and more often. Zanny's got a great question. Are we going to take these draconian steps every time?
I don't think we can, and I think politically the regime would be in trouble if it did. So I think these longer-term questions are the one to be focused on, not so much the calculations of GDP.
Chilean exports of wine.
Right, wine and cheese are piling up everywhere for the taking.
We're going to see more of those because I think a lot of people aren't really, you know, I certainly am not aware of the very details of these supply chains. So there's going to be really surprising consequences.
This globalization is a practical matter because it has effects around the world that we can't even anticipate.
Oh, that's absolutely true. And of course, right now, globalization has skeptics among elected leaders, including in the United States. And so these all feed that skepticism.
Well, this is a fascinating point. It's not just among leaders the globalization has skeptics. You see it in the United States. You see it in Western Europe. There are a lot of people in the populace who say, I'm not sure I like this globalization so much.
What is the president going to do in terms of his relationship with the Chinese leader and the reaction to China? Because on the one hand, if this is hurting the U.S. economy a lot, it's going to be something made in China that's hurting the U.S. economy, not so great. And it's also reinforcing this sense of division between the U.S. and China. So I'm kind of interested, Glenn, what do you think? Where does that shape up?
Well, I think it certainly would feed the president's skepticism. And let's remember that the president's opponents in this race are at least as skeptical as China, if not more so. In fact, he may be the China friend.
Yeah.
Many places in China officially got back to work this week after an extended Lunar New Year holiday because of the coronavirus outbreak. But things on the ground still remain pretty quiet and far from normal.
I went to a factory district of Shanghai. Songjiang district is where multinational corporations put some of their most sophisticated plants in China. We see operations there from Honda and 3M and Foxconn. The factories in Songjiang are ready for the workers to return. There are little booths set out in front of the gates of nearly every single one with equipment to take temperatures, to wash hands, and otherwise prepare for people from outside Shanghai to come back to work. But the factory zone is very quiet right now. It looks like the holiday continues. These manufacturers depend on migrant labor from other parts of China. But this year, after the Lunar New Year holiday, many are holding back. Some are put off by fears that they will get the coronavirus, so they're delaying plans. In other cases, they're really not allowed to leave their hometowns. The workers I spoke with were pretty uncertain about when things might get back to normal. Some talked of 2 days, others 10, or even longer. No one really knows. And the longer it lasts, the more this throttles the global supply chain. The coronavirus is shaping up to be a big problem for China's economy. That's definite in the short term. It depends how long it lasts, of course. But the economy is already growing at the lowest pace in 3 decades.